Now, slavery is an illegal and immoral trade that's been documented throughout history. But it is far from over. The reality of the modern slave trade is the focus of the Walk Free Foundation's report. The report found that hereditary slavery is deeply entrenched in the West African country of Mauritania, where 4% of the population is estimated to be enslaved. The Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan and Central African Republic are also amongst the worst countries affected. Well, joining me to discuss the report's findings on West Africa is Emily Revess from Red Light Campaign, an organization supporting survivors of modern slavery. Thank you very much indeed, Emily, for coming in. First of all, set the scene for us. I mean, what form does modern-day slavery take, and what is life like for a modern-day slave?
So modern-day slavery can take many forms. This ranges from debt bondage to serfdom to child slavery, marital and sexual slavery. And I think the fact that there are so many different forms today leads to a lot of confusion about actually what it means to be a slave today. But a modern-day slave just means someone who is in a position that they are unable to extradite themselves out of. And there are more slaves today than in the entire 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade. So it's a very prevalent problem in our world today, and it's a global violation of human rights.
In other words, they are in a situation in which, as you said, they simply can't pull themselves. In other words, yes, that power has been taken away from them.
Exactly.
And there is a huge prevalence of this in Mauritania. Mm-hmm. Tell us about how it occurs in that country.
So Mauritania was the last country in our world to formally abolish slavery, which only occurred in 1981. It only became a crime to own a slave in 2007. And since then, only one person has actually been incarcerated for owning a slave, and they were actually released after only 4 months for bribing an official. So the case of Mauritania really shows that there's a problem in the political and judicial system in saying what is slavery and how to acknowledge it and actually try and eradicate it in that country.
Now, let me just try and understand this, and also I'm sure our viewers would be keen to properly understand it. You're
Yes.
saying Mauritania abolished slavery in 2007. And when we talk about slavery, we're not talking about indentured servitude or I mean, being an indentured servant, mm-hmm, which is what you find across Africa and has been traditional. I mean,
yes,
we're talking about chattel slavery, which is the same sort of slavery that you had in transatlantic slave trade, where people were somebody's property.
Yes, exactly. And that is what's very prevalent in Mauritania. And it's one of the estimates vary, but this new report that was released yesterday from the Walk Free Foundation saying it has the highest prevalence of its population enslaved compared to all the rest of the countries in the rest of the world. However, the report did contain information that all 196 countries included in the report had slaves in their nation. So I think although it is important to look at Mauritania and look at the specific cultural context of that country, it's worth then applying it to the global context and saying if we have 35.8 million slaves across the world today, Mauritania is a really shocking example of that. But what are the wider implications for this kind of global slave trade?
What I don't understand is how is it that Mauritania just abolished slavery in 2007? I mean, aren't they part of the the world, the 20th and 21st centuries? I mean, how is it? Are they completely culturally cut off, I mean, from the rest of the world?
I wouldn't suggest they were culturally cut off, but I think there's a real ignorance of the real situation in that country. So, for example, the Minister for Rural Development was quoted in the CNN just this week as saying that they do not have a problem with slavery in Mauritania, which is obviously incorrect. So I think there's an acknowledgement that it's so ingrained almost in the society that they're not willing to really hold up a mirror and say, what is the problem and how are we going to address it?
So how does one actually find themselves enslaved? Are they born into slavery? Are they captured? I mean, because that's what used to happen in the sort of the old days. I mean, people were physically captured. Is that what happens, or are people born into it?
There's many different ways, again, that people find themselves enslaved. You can be born into a hereditary enslavement. You can also be coerced into it. So, for example, someone suggests they have a stable job for you, and then you arrive at a position where the job described to you was not the job you find yourself in, or there's kind of a debt bondage scenario where you're indebted to someone and they either kind of keep you enslaved to pay off that debt, or, for example, they could steal your passport. And it's a lot of coercion, but it's also kidnapping, and there's a huge amount of ways that people can get into such a situation, but there's very few ways that they can get themselves out. And
of course, talking about kidnapping, the report says the Boko Haram leader says in April the abducted Chibok schoolgirls would be sold as sex slaves. So that is another form of slavery, isn't it? I mean, how likely is it that that would have happened?
For women and girls, it's a very prevalent form of slavery, and unfortunately the value of someone who's sold into slavery is estimated to be, on average, only $90 American. And sex slavery obviously has enormous emotional and physical trauma on the women and girls in particular, although it does also affect men and boys who are sold into it. And often they're sold into a brothel, or they are sold as wives in some cases. And it's really a gross violation of human rights that I don't think should be accepted in the year 2014.
So what would you suggest would be the way to eradicate this?
Well, myself and the Red Light Campaign team that I work for believe that the most effective way to abolish slavery is, as the Walk Free Foundation suggested, is to find more effective ways to measure the real scale of the problem. So the estimate of 35.8 million slaves worldwide has been the largest number of its sort, which is actually an indication not necessarily of the growing prevalence of the issue, but of more effective ways of actually quantifying where these people are being trafficked and enslaved, and actually how we're investigating this hidden crime and how to make it more visible. And these numbers are shocking. So I genuinely believe that these reports and others like it are incredibly important as a first step to really understanding the issue and then trying to abolish it.
Very quickly, where is the demand coming from? And we know obviously Mauritania is one of them, but is it on the African continent? Is it for people from Africa going to another part of the world?
Often it's from other areas of the world. So some reports have suggested that the US has actually an incredibly high number of people being trafficked into the country. So I think it's a question of demand and supply, which really makes it an international crisis that every single country should work together on trying to eradicate, as there are so many streams of people being trafficked between regions and between countries.
Emily Revess from Red Light Campaign, an organisation supporting survivors of modern slavery. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.